I want to die with a fully unlocked skill tree. Like that is how I want to roll.
In my career of before starting boot dev, which was just like 7 years, I felt that way several times about certain coworkers. Every time it caught up with that coworker.
I had this boss at Taco Bell he's like as old as I am right now, but he just looked completely haggard and drained of life. He looked like a husk. And I was just like, I can't grow up and be like that. I need to get some skills.
It was about 2021, a year and a half after I started boot dev, that I was listening to the Indie Hackers podcast. It's a podcast by Cortland Allen and actually later Channing Allen as well. And I heard you on his podcast talking about freecodecamp, which kind of blew me away because it's a podcast about like small business. And here you were talking about this nonprofit that you'd been building. So anyways, I just want to say I'm super excited to have you on because I never thought back then in 2021 that I'd get the chance to meet you.
Yeah. Well, this is the second time because I had the pleasure of having you on the Free Code Camp podcast, which I host and publish every Friday. Yeah, like I'm a huge fan of Indie Hackers. Like running a charity, which is not necessarily the exact same thing as a nonprofit. Like nonprofits are like a superset of charities. So like technically Mark Zuckerberg's foundation is an LLC that has like a charity arm, but he can still like invest and do stuff like that. So just a pedantic difference. Like we are a straight up 501c3 public charity, tax exempt, supported like almost completely by donations from the community. We're not like, you know, like an arm of like Bill Gates' charity or something like that. So I just wanted to, I guess, start off with a pedantic note.
You're an actual charity. So nonprofit's a subset then of
superset.
Or sorry, a superset of charities. Yeah.
So like lots of nonprofit, like political oriented, but like those aren't necessarily tax exempt. Charities are specifically there for things that are a public good that the government doesn't have the bandwidth to do. What I like to say, like what the government doesn't necessarily have the competence to do, and what the corporations don't necessarily have like the profit incentive to do. So like, you know, food banks, you know, animal shelters, a lot like the YMCA is a charity. Wikipedia is a charity. Obviously Doctors Without Borders and, you know, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, like a lot of those different organizations are charities, and there's no expectation that they're going to make any sort of money or anything. And in fact, the expectation is they're going to get money from people who just have a little bit of extra money at the end of the year who want to donate, and then take those funds and, you know, optimally kind of like use those funds to actually do real world work to fulfill their mission.
Right.
Every charity has a mission. Like Free Code Camp's mission is very simple: to create free learning resources. And so we do that on math, programming, computer science, English as a second language. We've got courses on like AutoCAD. We've got courses on like FL Studio and music production. We've got courses on AI safety. We've got courses on like pretty much anything, because all that falls within our pretty broad tax exempt purpose.
I was going to say, I distinctly noticed the lack of code there in the mission. You're just like, it's to learn all the things.
I mean, we mostly teach math, programming, and computer science, but yeah, I like Free Code is in the name, so I didn't think it'd be like super helpful for me to like specify that. But yes,
yeah, you're not limiting, I guess is the way I'm saying it. Like math is, you know, fair game. Okay, very cool. By the way, I don't know if I said your name in that introduction. Quincy Larson, for everyone listening, founder of Free Code Camp.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah, sometimes I forget little details like the name of the guest.
Well, you're a busy dude, and I don't expect you to go quite as deep down the podcasting rabbit hole as I am. Like, I'm reading books by freaking Larry King, and like digging up old interviews that were conducted in like the 1970s, trying to like become like a S-tier interviewer and stuff like that. And you know, for me, it's like been this really long journey over the last 5 or 6 years. I can't remember when we published the first episode, and I took like a little bit of a hiatus, but I do this at like conferences and like stuff like that too. And I want to be really good at like teasing insight out of people. And so I do listen to, of course, Backend Banter. I think that's the one thing you and I have in common is we listen to copious amounts of interview format podcasts. And I also listen to like news, you know, like the Vergecast and stuff like that. It's like a huge part of my day to day is just like listening to people talk and learning from them. And I want to be able to tease the most insight out of people and like have kind of like the highest insight per minute type, whatever the metric for that would be, without just having it be information grazing where people are opining on a bunch of subjects outside of their field of expertise. Like kind of general comedians might be running those kinds of podcasts where they're just talking about whatever. I like to keep it a little bit more, scoped.
I think we probably are pretty similar in that regard. I think I listen to around 2 hours a day, just in between stuff. Because at the gym, I just listen to audiobooks and podcasts. In the car, always a podcast. The only exception is like if I'm with the kids in the car, then I'm either talking to them or listening to their music. A lot of Disney music.
My kids don't like listening to, 2.5x, BBC News.
Yeah. Oh, are you a 2.5xer? That's a good question.
I can go up to 2.5. Like when I'm listening to an audiobook or something where it's like, like a clean room type delivery. But if I'm listening to like British accents or Indian accents or something like that, like no way. I have to go down to 2. But like almost everything is 2 as a baseline. YouTube Premium just unlocked like up to 3x. So I'll watch YouTube at 2.5 or 3x too, depending on what I'm watching.
This is, I think, my unpopular opinion. Everyone I've talked to that's like an avid podcast listener like us listens at like high speeds. I actually listen at 1x.
Really?
Yeah, which like...
That gives you more room to think.
Exactly. Like it was spoken in 1x, and so I just enjoy listening to it at the rate that it was delivered. But I will say, like, I listen to my own podcasts and like edits of my stuff on like 2.5x to get through it very quickly because I've already heard it once. I'm just like reviewing it. But I think that is a fairly unpopular practice of mine. So I'm probably getting through content about half as fast as you are.
Yeah, well, you could argue that there's like a gate as to how much you can comprehend and how much you can retain. And it could be that like me trying to jam more in there does compromise on the, like if you were to listen to the exact same interview as I listened to, I expect you to walk away with more insight from it because it took you, 2.5 times as long. So you probably were able to like breathe and reflect. So there's merit to that approach too.
Yeah, I was going to ask, have you found that like... I guess what I'm saying is I've found that I used to listen like all the time, like every spare moment where like my brain wasn't occupied. So, driving, walking, running, exercising, like doing the dishes, mowing the lawn, always listening. I started only listening like 75% of the time. So I'll do some tasks now, consuming nothing. And I've found that I usually like a lot of insights come in that time where I'm not consuming, but like, they only come because I was previously consuming. Because like you said, I have time to like mull it over and think about how it applies to whatever I'm working on.
I do find that to an extent. Like I listen to a lot of music too, because like you, I know you're a drummer and I like to play lots of music. Like I do musical intros for each podcast episode. So I'll take a different like 1980s video game. So like today I'm doing Spy vs. Spy. If you see Spy, I'm gonna do it. I'm like just been practicing the bass line of the Spy vs. Spy song for like hours, trying to nail it. It's like awesome. This big walking bass line. But I find that when I'm listening to podcasts, I actually like hearing other people talk and things like that. Like my brain kind of thinks on top of that. And at some point, like it can kind of almost recede into the background. And like, I don't even realize it, but I've been, and I find that I have more insight when I'm listening to other people talk. It's a really weird phenomenon. I can't explain why. But it's like some sort of weird associative trigger where like all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting, and it could be unrelated to anything. I could be listening to a podcast about like Chinese history or something like that. And then just suddenly I'm thinking about some, potential gamification angle we could take, or I'm thinking about some like potential like way we could partner with somebody. It is not like clean and dry. The human brain is incredibly complicated, arguably the most complicated thing in the known universe other than maybe like Google's code base. And they have like a, 3 or 4 billion line code base. It's all in one big code repository. They have their own version control system and everything. And like nobody can understand that level of complexity, but I guess you can like kind of feel your way around. But the human brain is similar. Like we probably know 5% of what we're going to know 20 years from now or 30 years from now about how the human brain actually works. I don't know. Again, I don't want to talk outside my area of expertise, but I will say I don't understand how my mind works or why it works the way it does. But I find just jamming stuff in there and then sleeping a lot. Like I slept like almost 9 hours last night, sleeping a lot.
Wow.
And then waking up and like a lot of this stuff gets synthesized. And just the more kind of like different things I try to learn, the more divergent my insights are. And the more I'm able to like pull together loose associations. So Like I fancy myself like a Renaissance man in training. Like I've been learning world languages for like the last 25 years, basically. I've been learning just focused on like Japanese, Cantonese, and Mandarin, but like going really deep in those languages and like learning all the cultural quirks and the history and like the evolution of the Chinese characters through the millennia and stuff like that. And then also just like, I like swimming. I go and I swim like medleys and stuff like that. And like that just like, I don't know, like something about doing a whole lot of different stuff. Just it creates this weird soup in your head, and you never know what kind of chunks of what are going to float to the surface and enter your stream of conscious.
Some of my favorite podcasts and books have been from people who have deep expertise in one subject, but that's not the subject they're talking about.
Right.
Because you hear a lot of analogies and dotted lines drawn between different concepts. And it's like, if you only ever listen to backend developers talk about backend development, you'll get like one set of best practices and lessons learned. But then you hear a front-end developer or a game developer or a non-developer, right, talk about systems, and you hear a bunch of different stuff, and I think that's always pretty cool.
Yeah, like I like to stay in my lane and talk about software engineering and software engineering careers and stuff like that, but I will use analogies and I'll kind of fold in like insights from other fields that I've heard that are outside of my expertise. Now, I do not opine on like geopolitics or things like that because frankly, I don't have an informed enough opinion, and I don't want to give people like misinformation or have people walk away thinking my half-baked idea is actually how it is. But often I can find like parallels in like different things that I've read over the many years that I've been like basically just like in the soup, whatever, like reading tons of books. And like my entire like lifestyle is really focused around being able to learn as much as possible and jam as much as I can into my skull. Everything is optimized around that. Like the sleep cycle, I have everything routinized. I always wear the same clothes. I always eat basically the same breakfast. My week has a certain rhythm to it. I always walk my kids to school at exactly 7:20 a.m. And then I go walk to the YMCA and I do like the exact same like 30-minute workout. And then I walk home and like I'm listening to podcasts the whole time. And then my weekends are structured similarly. I've got like, I keep the same like sleep wake cycle 7 days a week. I work about the same amount every single day, regardless of whether it's a weekday or a weekend. Like I am like the ultimate like creature of routine. And this might be like a silly kind of like insight that you didn't ask for, but you can optimize your life for having like really eventful like memories and stuff like that, where you can look back like, oh, I remember that era when we were living in LA, and I remember, that party and that party, or I remember going skydiving there or doing that. Like, I don't do any of that stuff. Like, I basically just stay at home and I've optimized, instead of having memories, having artifacts of my time. And that could be, like recording a new cover song each week, or just making, steady progress with my various world languages that I'm learning, or improving my swimming time, or, improving, how many reps I can do with different weights and stuff like that. Like it's kind of like a productivity focused instead of like life. This is going to sound like toxic hustle,
instead of having a good
culture
time.
Stuff. Yeah. But like for me, it is having a good time. Yeah. I like doing things that I can measure. I like knowing that I'm making forward progress. I want to die with a fully unlocked skill tree. Like that is how I want to roll. I totally understand that people want to take trips to Hawaii and that they want to do things, and that's totally chill. And if you want to do that stuff, I don't want to shame any of that stuff, but that's just not me. Like I don't enjoy vacation. I don't enjoy getting out of my, routine because that invariably my sleep will be affected. My diet will be affected. My productivity will be affected. Like the various things that I do on a routine basis, like that, like it is going to derail. And I know that like, okay, I'm getting new memories here with this time that I'm spending, in this new place, or this time that I'm spending at this event. But at the same time, this is going to have a small, but probably quantifiable impact on my progress with the various things that I'm trying to learn. So in the back of my mind, there's like that anxiety that like, like I didn't get in like a full 2 hours of like learning today on top of, my 6 hours of work and, my 9 hours of sleep and my family time and like all these other things. Right. So I don't know. Like, again, I don't know if this is helpful or relevant for anybody who's listening, but this is just how like my brain works. I'm 44 years old And it took me a long time to find this rhythm. But now that I found that I've felt that I've fallen into this rhythm, I feel like this is me going like this with my goals, like very steady. It's very hard to catch up with somebody like me if you are not like in the rhythm. And a lot of people do not care. They don't want to they don't want to know a bunch of world languages. They don't want to be really good at a bunch of instruments. They don't want to be really good at like different things that I care about. They don't want to have this encyclopedic knowledge of XYZ and be able to theoretically go on Jeopardy and not get completely destroyed and stuff like that, right? Like that may not be a priority for them, but if they do want that, if you want that life of like skills and stuff like that, you've got to plan and you've got to get a system in place and you've got to adopt a routine and stick with it over the course of decades. And so like I can already kind of map out what's going to happen over the next 40 or 50 years, assuming I live into my 90s, and I'm hoping I do. I'm probably going to be doing more or less the exact same thing that I do today. But I'll probably learn things and like improve my process a little bit, but it's just like refining that process.
Dude, I thought I was a locked in creature of habit, and I'm learning that I'm a 50%er over here.
There's nothing wrong. It's just, it's a trade-off.
Like,
I'm trading memories. It's like Johnny Mnemonic. Like he gives up his childhood, but now he can carry this payload of like important data around and stuff like that. Right. I'm like kind of giving up a lot of memories that I could be forming. And as a result, I don't really look back because there's not a lot to look back to. Like I look back 5 years and I'm just standing here in the same exact position at my desk, probably talking to somebody for the podcast or probably working on, something. And I don't like take photos. I destroy my journal. Like I'll take a journal and I just destroy it afterward. Cause the point in journaling is not to have some artifact that you can look back at. What I was feeling at that moment is immaterial to me because I'm in this moment. Like, let's focus on this moment. And I don't think when I'm like 90 years old and I'm dying and stuff, I'm going to be like, oh, I wish I had something to look back to. No, I'm going to be like, all right, what's in front of me right now? What can I do now? And that's something I got from John Carmack. I was really interested. I read the book Masters of Doom, and he like aggressively just deleted any of his history and like just treated everything on his computer as ephemeral. The one thing I don't treat as ephemeral is relationships with other people. But, like I'll check in with people periodically. Like it could be years in between talking with people, but I make a point to like remember that stuff. And I kind of have my podcast, I guess. It's cheating because I can like go back and listen to one of the 160 or so episodes of the Free Code Camp podcast and kind of like get a vibe for where I was. But in general, like it's just that like kind of slash and burn, like plowing forward philosophy. I know that you haven't been asking me a lot of questions. I've just been rambling. I hope that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, we do that.
Yeah, because I have a profound amount of respect for you. And I just interviewed you a few like 3 months ago, and we talked for 2.5 hours. So I know a tremendous amount about you thanks to that. And I did re-listen to that before coming on this podcast so I could have all that fresh in my mind. And then of course I've just been like, watching and admiring and learning from the things you're doing and admiring your community and the cohesion and the camaraderie and of course the efficacy in learning these concepts is really inspiring for me.
Thank you. I mean, likewise, obviously. Free Code Camp's been around for a lot longer than boot.dev. On that note, so I'll give like the very quick version of the Free Code Camp origin story, just on the very unlikely note that anyone listening to this isn't familiar. But you're the teacher who started Free Code Camp. Has it been 10, 12 years?
It's been 10 years.
10 years? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Like it'll be 11 years in October.
Okay, 10 years. You're a self-taught developer. Like I said, you were in education, you were a teacher. Now you founded Free Code Camp. Been doing it for 10 years. Obviously, it's insanely popular, has helped so many people learn to code. So I wanted to just like speed run that really quick so we can talk about like Free Code Camp in 2025.
Sure,
like,
I can give you like I can give like just I worked as a teacher and a school director. I'll just go through the whole chronological thing. So I dropped out of high school. I didn't like have like a particularly happy teenage period. Like my family's great now. Like I'm on great terms with my family and stuff. But at the time, things were pretty rough. And I just moved out and like lived in my car for like a year and worked at like Taco Bell and did, construction, other random jobs that sucked, telemarketing. And then I was just like, man, I can't do this anymore. Like I have to go back to school. I had this boss at Taco Bell he's like as old as I am right now, but he just looked completely haggard and drained of life. He looked like a husk. And I was just like, oh, I can't grow up and be like that. I need to get some skills. So I did eventually go to school, and there was this very inexpensive state school. I know that you also took advantage of relatively inexpensive state universities, and they're just as good for the most part as like the Harvards and Stanfords of the world. That's like a big secret is if you just go to like a community college, like you're learning the same stuff. Like and you could Goodwill Hunting it and just get a bunch of textbooks and learn that way too. And that's how I learned a lot of my skills. Not that like, I do think that movie kind of exaggerates how much you can achieve through just pure self-teaching, like for dramatic effect. But I mean, the core tenet is true that you can just check out books from the library. And that's what I did. I basically lived in libraries when I was living in my car. I would just go spend all day at the library reading and stuff. That's where I really like realized the power of self-teaching and the power of, structured formal education is useful because you do want like a degree. So you can show employers like, hey, I can play along. I can check that box of making it through the ordeal that is going through university. I can get things together to where I can have the tuition to pay for it. And like my school was very inexpensive. It was literally $1,000 a semester, which is phenomenal. But I went in like 2000, right? So it's like before the not hyperinflation, but dramatic inflation that higher education has experienced. After I finished, I worked in some newspapers around town, and I was just like, yeah, journalism isn't really going anywhere. I need to get some new skills. So I went to China and I did a graduate degree there, and I studied finance, and that's where I met my wife of nearly 20 years. It'll be 20 years in a couple of weeks. Yeah, she and I were grad school classmates, and I just went really deep on learning first Mandarin, and then her language is Cantonese, so I've spent a lot of time learning that too. And then just picking up a lot of skills along the way. I went back to the States. I became a school director. I had some ESL teaching. I had about 5 years of teaching experience, just tutoring kids, and then like doing interpreting for like engineers from Brazil and stuff that were working in Chinese factories. I would like help interpret and I'd teach them stuff. Yeah, I got very lucky, got a school director job and ran schools in the US and in China. And then I wanted to like automate my school so it would be more efficient. And that's when I started learning Python. Yeah, it was just incredible how little I needed to learn to really be able to immediately start doing things. And nowadays, like you could use like a low code tool or a no code tool, or you could vibe code, I think is the new hot buzzword, where you just basically talk to, and you're like basically like a non-technical PM talking to an LLM and like getting them to do stuff for you and write basic scripts and then put those together into like a Node app or whatever. I did that sort of stuff, and it was just stunning how just a little bit of coding knowledge gave you this huge leg up. And then, so I just did tons of hackathons around California. I won a couple. I used that as my proof of concept and me as a developer to get my first developer job. And I worked there for like a year. And then I started freelancing and I moved to San Francisco because I was already in like Santa Barbara, which is it's like a 6-hour drive from San Francisco. So I just crash on, friends' couches in San Francisco and go to hackathons, just learn as much as possible and build projects to make money wherever I could for different clients and stuff. And then I built a bunch of projects and nobody cared. That's the first rule of building projects. If you listen to the Indie Hackers podcast backlog, or if you go on Indie Hackers and see the things people are building, like the general state of the universe is indifference, and you have to figure out something that does set the world on fire and like push past it. And after many, many projects that nobody cared about, I iterated toward freecodecamp, and then people did care about that. And so I've just been running freecodecamp for the past 10 years.
Yeah, and people love it. I remember when I started boot.dev, I was kind of looking around because I mean specifically, obviously, boot.dev is focused primarily on backend stuff. But I was looking around at like the whole coding education landscape, and there were a few brands, not going to name them right now, that like usually when you saw them mentioned on social or Reddit or whatever, there was like a bad taste in people's mouth. And freecodecamp was the one that like basically no one ever had anything bad to say about. There are a couple others as well. I shouldn't say freecodecamp is the only one, but it was definitely the one that most stuck out because it's also one of the largest.
Yeah, and I attribute a lot of that to like we don't really care whether people use freecodecamp or not. Like it's kind of like the Gen Xer like hipster, Kurt Cobain approach to creating projects is like you just don't really care that much if people. Like the right people will find you and they'll use you, and you don't need to run ads and like, this week's sponsor is, free code camp. Yeah, like we've never
Hard
spent
to
a
do when
dollar
you're a
on
charity.
Yeah, we've never spent a dollar on advertising. So we just rely on word of mouth, and people use it and they like it, and we continue to improve it. We've got a very active open source community, and if you're ever looking for a project to contribute to that'll be receptive and not just shoot you down or be all elitist and snobby and stuff, like consider contributing to Free Code Camp. It's a great first project to contribute to, and we've got like more than 50,000 merged issues and pull requests. Yeah, it's like it's one of the most active GitHub repos that's not just being like maintained by AIs, I guess, because everything we're doing is actually involving, actual open source contributors. Yeah, we haven't handed everything over to Devin.
That would be expensive. 50,000 pull requests on Devin.
Yeah. Well, open source is free because it's just people volunteering their time, and energy. Right. And so if you're like a charity, you just like to keep the overhead as low as humanly possible.
Okay, cool. So tell me about it's been a couple years, honestly, since I did a deep dive on like the Free Code Camp project. I've obviously followed the YouTube channel. I see the content you guys are putting out, the articles. What are like the big things that you guys have been preoccupied with over the last, let's just say, year or two?
Well, I'm really inspired what CompTIA has done in terms of, having like security plus type certifications and things like that. And so we want to create we have created a formal kind of certification process. We've always had certifications, but it's just like a proof of learning essentially. And it's a certification you can link to on LinkedIn. It's got its serial number and its QR code, and it's unique to you and verified, living on a server somewhere, living on Free Code Camp servers. So there's a URL that people can, visit. And our alumni network it's like 2 million people follow Free Code Camp, but only like maybe 200,000 of those people have earned an actual certification over the years. A lot of those people are working at like FANG companies and stuff like that. I did like a kind of a meta analysis of like our alumni network a few years ago and found that like there were at least 40,000 people who'd gotten their first developer job after they'd earned a Free Code Camp certification. This was like 5 or 6 years ago. So you can imagine it's probably a higher number now. But we just want to formalize that. So what we've done is instead of having, like all these different smaller certifications that can be earned in like a few hundred hours, we have this big, it's called Certified Full Stack Developer. And that is a certification that covers like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but it also goes deep in accessibility, talks a lot about like relational databases, and it's not a backend focused certification, like curriculum, like what you've built, but it does touch on like all that stuff. And, JavaScript, Python, and what I consider to be the most important skills like Linux, Bash, Git, skills that have been around for decades and are probably going to remain around, even though, to some extent, like the tools will continue to improve. And it could be that people aren't writing Bash scripts anymore. They're just going to some tool and saying, hey, I need a Bash script that does X, Y, Z, and then taking that and running that. But I still think my philosophy is you do want to learn the fundamentals. The farther down the stack you can go, the better. You always want to be like able to comprehend at least a few layers of abstraction down. I'm not saying that a full stack developer needs to understand bytecode or assembly or anything like that. They don't necessarily need to know memory management if they're doing full, but I would argue there's no harm in learning those things. There is no knowledge that is not power. That's from like the Mortal Kombat 3, like arcade teaser, like the attract mode. It's like, there is no knowledge that is not power. And then that, like as a kid, I saw that and I was like, damn, I need to keep learning.
Needs is such a tricky word. This is like, I feel like this is one of the most tricky parts of when someone's getting into any career that requires technical skills. It's like, I hate this question. What do I need to know? It drives me insane because the minimum amount that you need to know to get like a job in development sometimes is crazy low. Like I have seen developers that are employed that have almost no skills. Like they're really bad, but like they got really lucky. And so like need is such a scary word. So I always encourage people like, instead of talking about need and barriers and thresholds, like let's talk about what is useful? Like, what is most useful to know, and what's going to give you the highest chance of success and the highest chance of being able to move up and take on bigger projects? It's such a gray area. That needs word just irks me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're always going to have outliers. And the important thing is that you listen to a lot of podcasts like this one, and you fill up like a kind of a gestalt, like a general instinct for, okay, it sounds like that is like an aberration. That is not like likely, regression to mean type behavior, that somebody got a job because they like met somebody at like South by Southwest and like had drinks with them. They're like, yeah, we're looking for a developer. Like that's like kind of like the Cinderella story, but that doesn't usually happen. What usually happens is people grind and grind and grind, or they win a series of hackathons, and they do like, so I'll go ahead and give you like the 35,000 foot like overview of how I think people get jobs, if that's helpful.
Oh yeah, do it.
Skills, reputation, network. The entire job search thing is about de-risking yourself and in the eyes of potential employers. Everybody just wants to hire somebody that they know is going to stick around and be a productive team member for many years, so they don't have to go hire somebody else. Hiring people is expensive. It's very time intensive. Hey, it's not fun. Oh, let's go get all our senior engineers and let's have them do round after round of interviews with candidates. That's not like something anybody relishes doing. And the entire process is very filled with, cognitive biases and stuff like that. And it's just messy. Like, let me ask you a question. Does John Carmack have a hard time getting a job? Everybody knows who John Carmack is. If John Carmack tweeted right now, like, hey, I'm looking for a job, you better believe recruiters from Apple, from Netflix, from everybody would be reaching out to him, being like, hey, would you like to come work? And that's because he's John Carmack. He has that reputation, right? I'm not saying that you're going to go create Doom and create like Oculus and create like write all these AI papers and stuff like that and like build your reputation. But you absolutely could. There's no reason you couldn't develop similar levels of skill. Now, to some extent, you could argue he was in the right place at the right time in the 90s, where like ray tracing was new and like, these 3D worlds and all this stuff. Like he was able to kind of like ride the state of the art wave. You could do that too, right? And then, 30 years later, you're John Carmack. And I say John Carmack because I mentioned him earlier because I like, for me, he's kind of like the archetypal kind of like purist developer from kind of my generation, right? You could argue that there are lots of older people that laid foundations in other ways, but he's like the person I always looked up to as kind of like a serious developer who really cares about their craft and has built a lot of impactful products. But the skills, this is something that you mentioned that I love. When I was just listening to our podcast interview while I was going for a walk earlier, you mentioned one thing about like being able to communicate your skills. 8 out of 10 developer who has 2 out of 10 communication skills is only going to be able to communicate that they're a 2 out of 10 developer, right? So communication skills are absolutely a gate, and you could roll that into, potentially reputation and network. But I think of those as the 3 legs of the stool. Like your skills, a lot of people over-index on skills, and you definitely know these people when you see them. They are just like really down out in the weeds, trying to like learn new frameworks and learn new tools, or eke out a little bit more performance on some algorithm. Anything they can do to procrastinate actually going out there and having to awkwardly go to meetups and meet people, because the network is a huge part. And that's just how humans work. It is who you know to an extent, but you do need to have the skills when you get in the room with them so that you can actually demonstrate that. And you've probably met plenty of people. Everybody listening to this has met the person who never codes, never practices, and always laments, it's so hard to get a job. I keep doing these interviews and I never get to, because they haven't put enough time. And they may be able to get lots of interviews, but they're not able to convert those interviews into offers because they don't have the ability to demonstrate the skills. And then reputation is kind of like the X factor. Like, if you have a strong enough reputation, you should be able to get client work. And if you've done a lot of client work, then a lot of companies will just look at that, and that's like almost a shortcut through the interview. I was able to benefit from reputation from having won some hackathons around California, so that I just could like kind of jump the queue, and like they immediately considered me a serious dev, and they didn't even give me like a technical interview at my first job. Right? Yeah. Like they were just kind of like talking more practically, like, like I guess like design pattern questions. but I didn't, at no point did I have to stand up on the whiteboard and like invert a binary tree or anything like that, right?
Yeah, I've been surprised at how many job interview processes I've been involved with that kind of didn't have like a hard technical component.
Yeah.
Like there were some questions that kind of sussed out like, okay, does this person like kind of know what they're talking about? But like there was a lot of trust involved.
Yeah.
Right? Just like that you can
Which is
do
trust
what you
that
say
like
you can do.
like a narcissistic personality disorder type person can exploit.
True.
Like you definitely hear about like people in like kind of exploiting those mechanisms of reciprocation and things like that, and like just getting into the organization without necessarily having the skills. It's so common that the Chinese have an expression for this. Like it's an ancient Chinese idiom, which I think is something about like it's playing the flute. I won't say the Chinese because I'm not sure that I'm going to nail the tones. I'd have to look it up. I like love memorizing these and my memory's failing me here, but basically like playing the flute in the orchestra and passing off as one of the orchestra. Like basically you, in theory, because there are so many people that are playing the flute in the orchestra, you could be playing along, but you don't actually know what you're doing. And so this guy like got into like the court's like orchestra and was supposed to be playing the flute. And like the moment that they are like, all right, we're going to go and do like solos or we're going to go ahead and work on it. And after many years of being able to like essentially pretend that they were there, they just kind of like snuck out in the middle of the night and left because they knew that they wouldn't be able to actually perform like a recital or something as a solo. So like that phenomenon has always been there. And you'll always see people that you think like, oh man, how are they able to get by with such mediocre skills, or how, maybe they are related to somebody at the company or something like that. Just know that those people are outliers and don't let that affect your own motivation. Like it's easy to look around and see people that are getting the same compensation you are, working the same job title and all that, and say like, I'm better than them at what I do. Like I'm contributing way more and don't think in those terms. Just focus on what you can control, which is your own skills, and ignore the people that have managed to. And this is also why whenever there's like, like I'll tell you how not to do a layoff.
That's useful, a lot of companies, I hope I never have to use it, but yeah.
A lot of companies are like, all right, if you want to leave, we'll give you like the way that they're doing with the federal government. Like if you want to leave, we'll pay you through September. That's exactly how you get all your high skilled players who have options to jet. And then you're stuck with these people that know they don't have better options elsewhere.
Right.
And that is like a mistake I've seen made so many times by so many people over the years. And it just makes prima facie sense. Like you wouldn't ever want to, like let
if you
people
want
go.
To be generous, you should pick the people to lay off and then be generous to them.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, but it's just like lazy. And like so many companies have like basically just lost. Like they still have the headcount. I suspect this is probably what's going on at Boeing and a lot of other companies that have been like crashing and burning lately. Sorry for the analogy there. It was unintentional. But basically like Boeing is literally having planes fall out of the sky and they're literally losing billions of dollars on contracts and stuff like that because all their A players pieced out a long time ago, but all the people who are like pretending to play, the flute with the orchestra, they're still there in their cubicles, like basically acting busy, and their entire company's filled with that. And I don't know how they come back from that.
Yeah, I was going to say, so like obviously at the company level, it does catch up eventually. I've been amazed at how long a company can perform very poorly and remain solvent. It can go on for many, many years. I will say to your point about like, try not to get frustrated when you have like a coworker that's maybe not performing as well as you think they should be, and yet maybe they're getting compensated at the same level or higher than you. In my career of before starting boot dev, which was just like 7 years, I felt that way several times about certain coworkers. Every time it caught up with that coworker. Like there were layoffs, that person was affected. Like it doesn't, and I'm not saying the world is perfectly just, but I will say it's more just in the long term than it is in the short term. So it's very easy to like see something that you feel like is not fair. Again, maybe someone's being compensated incorrectly. And like that happens all the time in the short term. It happens less often in the longer term. The skills do help you long term and your reputation will grow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would just say like, don't like look at your lazy coworkers as an excuse for you yourself to slack off. And this is one of the things that you've said that I found very important. Like if you're going to be a developer, why not be, top 10 percentile developer? Like,
Yeah.
why not do what you do well, and why not take pride in it, and why not just, instead of going out and drinking Friday night with the guys and doing X, Y, whatever it is that, these people that are not concerned about their career do.
We're not sure, but whatever they do.
Yeah, whatever they do, whatever, like whatever they're not doing or whatever they're doing when you're working hard to continue to extend your skills, don't feel like you're missing out, because again, like, it is absolutely worth the time and energy to be involved in shaping your future and being proactive. And yeah, the last thing you want is to become complacent and use, the complacency of people around you as as like kind of an excuse to not continue to work hard.
It sounds so like corny and like, business motivational, but genuinely the people I meet that are getting into coding, there are some that have the mindset of, again, it's like, what do I need to learn? What's this like minimum amount, the threshold I need to get through to be able to get a job in tech? And then there's other people that are very concerned about, like, how do I write the best code that I can? How do I get as good as I can be? And they're very different mindsets. And
Yeah.
I've seen a lot more success with the latter.
Yeah, I think what happens is people that like the former, those people probably do get jobs faster, but they don't necessarily hold the jobs, and they don't necessarily get the good jobs, and they don't necessarily continue to ascend because they're always just looking at the shortest path instead of focusing on the long game.
Okay, this brings up an interesting point that I'd been meaning to ask you about. My perception was that particular thing, shortcutting your way into tech, just to be like really kind of crass and direct about it, shortcutting your way into tech worked better in like 2018, 2019, when the field was less saturated, when interest rates were low, like all those sorts of things, and it's working less now. And I'm curious if you hold that same view, because I mean, you work with a lot more students. We both work with a lot of students. Well, you work with a lot more students. I mean,
during the .com boom in like 1998, 1999, you could learn some like very basic skills and go to San Francisco and potentially get a job at one of these bubble companies that had these massive valuations that were not warranted, and they couldn't hire people fast enough. You hear all these stories of like people my age, and I never did this. Like I guess I probably could have, but I was too busy like sleeping in my car and working at the library. I really wish if I could go back in time, I really wish I'd just driven out to San Francisco and done exactly what I did in my hometown of Oklahoma City, but in San Francisco. And I probably would have had extemporaneous, like meetings with people, and they probably would have wrote me in and be like, oh yeah, you should come work at our company. Like some guy I met at a party, because it used to be that easy, right? And then it was pretty easy when I got a job in 2011, I think, is when I got my first developer job. It was pretty easy in the sense that it was not like it is today. It has certainly gotten harder, and the floor has definitely risen up in terms of the skills that you need to be able to have to become a professional developer. Now, there will still be lots of freelance work, and I encourage people to like kind of bootstrap their learning through freelance work. Just find that local business that needs like, a Shopify site or something like that, and just do whatever you can do to make money in the near term. But don't let like small, bursts of revenue. I mean, that's like the Uber model, right? Like trick everybody into thinking they're going to get rich driving Uber, and then what they're really doing is like making enough money to like pay off the car that they bought. They're kind of like taking out like a loan to get a car, and it's almost like they're getting paid to drive around, and it's like the car is paying itself off rather than them actually getting rich. There are a lot of situations where you could go for the easy money, right? Like you could just go, like I remember working as a journalist, and like I had lots of friends that were bartenders that made way more than I did, but they weren't going to be making way more than I did, 20 years from then. Right. I would continue to ascend and get new skills and stuff like that. So the way I would look at it is, there have been periods of time where somebody who knew relatively little, like the boot camp craze of 10 years ago, when everybody was paying $30,000 to go to some 9-week boot camp and ostensibly getting the skills that they needed to go work at a big tech company. There are those periods, but they are not representative. And also, when you have like shaky foundations, it really limits your ability to continue to grow and expand your skills. So Like my advice has always been with Free Code Camp, learn to code slowly. Coding is hard. Anybody who tells you that learning to code is easy, they're just trying to sell you something, trying to sell you some expensive boot camp or some indentured servitude agreement. I say they're going to like just basically after you've given them the money, and they'll give you like pay lip service to the fact that you gave them the money and give you, okay, here's the curriculum, all this stuff. And you're going to work through it. And then you're going to find yourself at the end of that feeling like, okay, maybe I could get a job at some really, like some local bank or something like that, doing some very basic software development, or maybe I'll have to like learn a whole bunch of things that are completely unrelated to that, and I'll be able to get a job like maintaining some old legacy system because the guy who used to maintain it is like trying to retire, and he's desperately trying to find somebody who's interested in COBOL to learn under him so he can get out of there. You may be able to find those kinds of opportunities, but for people who actually go and get a computer science degree, which I'm a big advocate of, if you're young and you have money to pay for school and it's not going to potentially cripple you and your family's future going into debt, go get a computer science degree and learn the fundamentals, read all the classic books, like spend time actually learning how to code in C and figuring out how to do actual SQL queries instead of relying on, NoSQL databases to just handle everything for you. Like learn those actual tools, and you'll find that you have like the scaffolding upon which you can learn anything as you go forward. And the fact that things are changing and you're having to learn all this stuff is not going to be a huge consequence, because there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like, you could argue like neural networks are new but like really what has happened is they've just improved and they're much larger than they used to be. And so we had the big breakthrough in LLMs, but that was like stuff that had been explored probably in like the 80s and 90s. And it was just that we finally had a breakthrough, and that started
finally
working
had
better.
enough data,
yeah.
Right? And transformers, of course. But yeah.
So to get back to your question, I do want to make sure I answer your question just instead of just rambling. There are certainly periods where, like Facebook and Google and like all these companies were basically stocking up on developers because they had like 0% interest rates effectively, and they wanted to hoard talent just in case they needed it. And then when it became clear during the pandemic that like things were going to slow down a little bit, or like the interest rates were going to go up or anything like that, they just started cutting a lot of those people. And what that did for a lot of people learning to code, we saw the job market go from here to here, and then it went back down to here. But people forget when they look at they're comparing to here, and they're not comparing
right.
to like a year or two before that, before the market spiked. So like, oh, there are no jobs anymore. It's just senior engineers and that I'm competing with on the job market and all this stuff. And then this doom and gloom enters. And then that's like a trap, because then you're like, oh, what's the point in learning? Because I'm not going to be able to compete with those senior engineers. There are no jobs. And you use that as an excuse to tell yourself to give up and try to get a real estate license, or like whatever it is people do when they give up on learning to code. But the jobs are still there, but they are going to be a little bit harder to get. And with some time and practice, you can get those jobs.
You wrote a book on this, in fact, How to Learn to Code and Get a Developer Job.
Yes.
Amazing book. Google How to Learn to Code and Get a Developer Job, and it will be there right below any ads. Google.
Yeah, just Google Learn to Code book, and it should be like within the top 3 or so results. They're like, I say this, but like Google has just been so clogged with AI slop that I wouldn't be surprised if like a lot of my articles that I used to be like very proud, like, oh wow, 1,000 people read that this month. Like people just create new versions of my articles, and it's obviously derivative of my article. You might even link to it, but it like ranks above my original article just because it's longer, because it's got more AI fluff that they added, which is super frustrating. I'm hoping that they solve these issues, because I'm getting really sick of using Google and just finding like clearly AI written articles that were probably written by consuming like thoughtful writing by people I actually know what they're talking about. Anyway, I'll get off. I'll stop being an old man yells at cloud here.
No, yeah, I'm with you there. Google's an absolute disaster. The fact that the results are sometimes below the fold is like, anyways, it's crazy. But okay, great book. Go read it. Question for you though. So I actually covered the book in the video that I made for Free Code Camp.
Excellent course.
Thank you.
It was titled "How to Get a Developer Job," and I think like I went in and I said, even in this economy. And when I changed the title, it immediately made a difference. and a lot of people were like, the economy's not that bad. Like, look at these numbers and everything like that. Like, you could argue that inflation. Sorry, I'm going to get on my soapbox and I'm going to say like, yeah, technically, like inflation was like 3% last year or whatever, but like. I feel it when I go to the grocery store. I feel it everywhere, and I think everybody does. And, the metrics are clearly out of step. So to all the people who are like, why are you complaining about the economy? Like, according to the, big metrics and stuff, everything's fine. But I do think that like things have become more expensive, certainly here in the U.S. And actually, the U.S. is like much less hard hit than other places in the world. So anybody who took issue with me adding the even in this economy to it, like that clearly resonated with a lot of people, because a lot of people watched the course after I added that to the end of the title.
Yeah.
But it was an excellent course. I don't want to take credit, like just changing but like that was definitely like, I think a lot of people were like, oh, okay, this is like practical advice and it's based on like actual reality. It's not just like theoretical stuff. And then of course the fact that the Primogen was in the screenshot and he has just had this meteoric rise. He's been kind of like the seer for a lot of tech news and stuff. Like I learned a lot about different things going on through watching his channel. And so that has really coincided. And I understand that you've even got some courses from the Prime, I'll call him Prime, on boot.dev, which is awesome. He's like a huge inspiration for me. And like, he's like a real engineer who's also a very good, like kind of Neil deGrasse Tyson style science communicator.
Yes. Yeah, he's amazing. It was a very strategic move to put him in the thumbnail. I mean, he's in there, right? Like
he's in the video. It's not like we just put him in the thumbnail, but yeah.
I had like 10 guests, read a chapter from your book. Like, yeah, it was a lot. There was a lot of. I want to do this is like getting back to my question. This is actually a lot of what I wanted to talk about. Like, I want to remake that course this year. It'll have actually been almost 2 years in like 6 months. And I wanted to hear your take because, again, you wrote that book almost 2 years ago.
Yeah, I've updated it a few times. Like,
yeah, what's changed is kind of my question, I guess.
So, like, this is going to sound like a cop-out, and like I totally understand if people are listening to this and they're like, he's just burying his head in the sand. I genuinely think that not a lot has changed. I think these tools are good. I use AI a lot. Like our team uses AI a lot. We don't use AI to create code. We don't use AI to create articles, or we use it to create transcripts for podcasts. I used it all the time to like fact check my articles and catch typos and stuff like that. But I don't actually take generated text and drop it in my articles because frankly, like I've written hundreds of articles at this point. I have, a background in journalism, having worked in newspapers and like, I've written a book and doing other stuff like that. Like and I've studied lots of foreign languages. I consider myself to be like an S tier English speaker, even if I say and stuff like that. Like, by the way, saying and like is not indicative of somebody not being sophisticated or, knowledgeable of what they're saying. It's just a stop word to indicate to Lane, like, hey, don't jump in quite yet because I'm still going to say something more. It's kind of a subconscious process, but people who try to expunge those from their speech, it's been shown that it makes them less relatable, and also that it there's another Oh,
that's interesting. Yeah.
It makes people trust them less. So it's actually beneficial to just talk naturally and not try to like spend a whole bunch of time. I'm going to eliminate every or I've got my jar. Whenever I say I put it in there, and using mild profanity like, damn, what the hell? Stuff like that also makes you more relatable. So you don't have to like cut all that stuff out and talk like, a news anchor on, whatever. I don't know. I don't watch TV, but like
it's practically political to name a network. So network here. Yeah.
Yeah. My point is, don't be afraid to say or like, and don't think people are less smarter because they use those terms. A lot of people who are extremely good, like Fields Medal winners and stuff like that, they can't even necessarily communicate that crisply, but they can think crisply. And I do think that with practice, crisp thinking translates into crisp talking, but you have to actually spend time and energy. It's not like reading a bunch of books is just going to naturally make you as eloquent as Neil deGrasse Tyson, whom we mentioned earlier.
I ripped this saying from someone, and so I apologize, but I've been repeating it for like years now, especially to my team at boot.dev, which is like clear thinking leads to clear writing, which leads to clear thinking. Sometimes you'll hear someone say something like, well, I understand it, I just can't explain it. And I'm like, well, then explain it. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? Like sitting down and explaining it, maybe you did understand it okay. I guarantee if you can clearly explain it to someone, you will understand it more deeply, right? You'll get the words right. You'll get the terms right. And that will in turn help your understanding, which will then help you explain again. And sorry, all this circles back to LLMs, basically, which is like we were talking about how what AI is doing. And I'm trying to think back through the points that I went over in the video, and by and large, I agree. Like fundamentally, the fundamental concepts that you talk about in the book and that I go over in the video haven't really changed much. I will say I take a very I try to take as a pragmatic an approach to AI as I can. Partly because, I mean, I like to succeed in my career. And so I just want to do as well as I can. And also I feel like I owe it to my students to be like as aware of how these tools are impacting like developer work, such that the courses that we're building like take that into account. But my experience has been very similar in the sense that I have generated code and lessons with AI. I have not published them because they're shit. Well, that's not entirely true of the code. Like sometimes like, you know, it'll autocomplete some stuff and like that's good. That's like how I would have written it. But like the writing in particular, like the ideas are just so bland. It's just like what most commonly comes up when a point is talked about.
By definition, it's kind of an average, unless you kick the spiciness, what is it called? The temperature up really high?
Yeah, the temperature up, yeah.
And I mean, even then it's still going to be pretty bland.
Well, and then it adds, like in my experience, it is like the words that are chosen, like the spiciness goes up, but the ideas are still bland as hell. It's still just like the middle of the road idea.
Yeah, like you can just tell when something's written by an LLM, which is frustrating for me. Again, I'm Google searching and I can tell this was not written by a real human being because like they take like so long to express even the most basic idea, and then they have to spend all this time like just because they're trained on the entire internet, and where there's like kind of a black and white, like they will try to introduce gray just because they don't want to offend anybody, and they don't want like the companies that create these, like OpenAI doesn't want somebody like, oh, what's wrong with this LLM? Why is it saying this? You know, it has an agenda or something like that. So it has to like kind of thread this needle, and that really limits its usefulness. But like code is generally not controversial. I mean, you might find some people that are like, oh, that is not clean code, you know, like why is it repeating itself so much or something like that. And so you could find like controversy in code generated by Copilot or something like that. But I think generally that's less common, but it is still, it's just an average of everything in its training data, really. And then like, obviously there's, you know, reinforcement learning with human feedback, and that kind of like brings out the spikes a little bit, but still, I think the very process through which these are created, it does limit their usefulness. And you could say like, well, why not just train your own? And yeah, you absolutely could. And you should learn how to do that. You should learn how they work. And it may not be that far away. I mean, we saw the breakthrough with DeepSeek R1, which dramatically reduced the cost of developing, you know, an LLM that can essentially pass a lot of the benchmark exams and stuff like that. And that could just be the beginning.
One thing that seems to me to be true, this is like one of the things that I actually feel fairly confident asserting about AI, and I'm interested to hear your take, is that across like all knowledge work, so forget just software engineering jobs, but like literally anyone that like sits at a computer for their job.
Yeah.
Right? Any like white collar office work, even though now it's, you know, hoodies and sweatpants for a lot of us. It makes everyone like a very baseline mediocre, like jack of all trades. Like you can kind of get stuff done. You know what I mean? And that seems to definitely be happening because I've seen myself doing it in like non-tech work that I have to do, right? Getting it to like, do you see anything wrong in this legal contract? By the way, I do not recommend just relying on ChatGPT for legal advice, but I would be lying if I haven't ran through contracts through an LLM and just said, do you see anything that I should be particularly worried about?
No, it's really good for that. Like, did they put some sort of clause in this, you know, very vanilla, like I signed a non-disclosure agreement yesterday, and I can't tell you whom I signed it with, because that would violate the non-disclosure agreement, I think. But anyway, my point was like, okay, this giant corporation just sent me a non-disclosure agreement. I'm going to read it. I read everything I sign, and I encourage you to do so. And if the contract is overly long, I would just reply and say, hey, do you have like a shorter version of this? I don't really want to like have to comprehend all this different stuff. There's usually like indemnity clauses and like intellectual property clauses and stuff like that. But like taking that contract and just putting it into you know, one of your LLM models and just saying, hey, is anything weird about this? That I think that's totally legit use case, because if somebody inserted like your firstborn child or something as a clause in there, then you should know about that. But you might miss that if you're just reading tons of legal documents as a non-lawyer. And a lot of people might say, oh, you should have your lawyer review every single document. Like, that's going to get very expensive very quickly if you're a small business. So I do think that this is like, these are really useful tools for that sort of stuff. I was trying to decide whether to let my cat outside with bird flu and stuff like that. And so I did talk with the LLM and be like, hey, like, what are the odds of this happening? And I cross-referenced that with other research that I did about cats getting bird flu and stuff like that. But I didn't want my cat to unnecessarily just stay in all day because of like fear mongering. And like, you know how the media is, like the most minor thing, suddenly it's like this huge, headline in the news cycle for a few days. And I didn't want to just react to that. I wanted, okay, what's a rational, like, when I drive my car, I am taking like a risk reward contract. I could get plowed into by some, giant semi or something and die. But like, it's worth me getting to wherever I need to go. And the odds of me getting hit by a semi are so low that I can take a calculated risk. And I don't just have to huddle in my storm shelter and live in fear for my entire life. Right. So I think it's a helpful tool for evaluating risk and just kind of like establishing like a baseline of what is likely to happen, what is most common. And so I do think it's very useful for people to get a decent general baseline in different skills. Like you mentioned, like if you're a non-native English speaker, you can take your, reference letter or whatever, put it into an LLM and it can say, oh, I noticed you use this usage. Like this isn't common vernacular in India where you're applying for a job. Like let's change it to use this term, or here's a grammatical error. Like it can catch that sort of stuff. Whereas it wouldn't necessarily be worth it to like go on Fiverr and hire somebody to do that at like, hey, can you review my, thing, or bother like your native English speaking friend. And then you're like kind of indebted to them. Like, or maybe they're just like, he's always sending me his documents and asking me to proofread. I'm like, I don't care. And then you have to wonder, okay, are they even going to do a good job? It's hard for me to judge whether they did a good job. Right. And that's like the fundamental thing with LLMs is like, you have to kind of trust that the output is okayish because you yourself don't necessarily have the skills to be able to evaluate the output. And that's where cross-referencing comes in and potentially reaching out to experts. But again, like LLMs make cheap what used to be expensive. I think that's their core value proposition. It used to be really expensive for me to call up a lawyer and say, hey, can you review this non-disclosure agreement that I got from XYZ Corp? And they can be like, sure, that's going to be 2 billable hours. Oh, that's going to be like $600. I guess. And then like you sign the NDA and then you go forward and there's no deal that ever materializes. It was just like a basic upfront document to even start going down the path of potentially having a partnership or something like that. And you're already at $600, right? Like, I don't know that it would actually cost that much in billable hours, but like now GPT can just double check it and say, this looks very standard. And then I could have a relative peace of mind and I can proceed with it. Right. So that is a use case. You can also say like, you could put code in there and you could be like, hey, is there any malware in this code likely? Or something like, let's say you're not a developer and, a contractor whom you're working with for the first time, you want to make sure they're not going to like use your servers to farm Bitcoin or something like, hey, can you take a look at this code base and make sure there's not like any suspicious, call outs to like different servers or something like that. Right. Like, so I do think it gives everybody kind of like generalist powers. It makes every individual a little bit more powerful, just like spreadsheets made people a little bit better at doing math and calculators and before them and, databases. So you don't have to have a perfect memory and like have your own logs and stuff. I use Google Gmail all the time. Like I'll search through things and I kind of have like a giant memory of like every conversation because I'm emailing myself notes and stuff like that. Like these tools do make you more powerful. And I think that's a profound and useful thing. But I don't think they fundamentally change the nature of work to where like what I hear the hype around vibe coding, like that you're just going to be a PM and you don't even need to learn to code and you can just sit there and have like a Star Trek like conversation with it. I think we might get there eventually, but even then you still need to do the actual work of thinking about what needs to be done and being able to evaluate the output of it. Not to go on a tangent, but like back in the maritime age, the age of sails, you would have a captain on a ship and that captain would have essentially held every single job on the ship as part of their training for being a captain. So they swabbed the deck, they prepared the gruel, they knew how to tie all the knots, they knew how to like which sails to raise when, they knew how to shoot an azimuth, and all those different things that like a captain might, and I'm probably revealing a lot of my ignorance about conning a ship there. But basically, they knew all that stuff so they could actually evaluate the performance of the other people on their team, on their crew. And that way, they didn't have to just trust that the navigator knew what they were doing. They could go and inquire. And maybe the navigator had an absolute advantage in terms of navigation skill, but they at least knew enough to be relatively conversant in navigation so that they could kind of sanity check the decisions their navigator was making. Because like a mistake like that, and like you're in like the Arctic Circle and you're dead back then, right? So it was very important to know where you were going. And it's very important to know that, for example, you've got enough supplies and that somebody remembered to add the lime juice to the food so that people don't get scurvy and like all these different things, right? And so the captain had this general knowledge, and you could argue to an extent, it's almost kind of like with LLMs, you have access to a captain and you don't necessarily need to be like decent at all the different things you're managing. But I would argue that it's still worth the time and energy to like learn the foundation so you can still evaluate the output of these LLMs. And certainly if you're going to be a leader, you should do those jobs first. Like I don't put a lot of stock in, tech company founders that are not technical because they don't even understand like the fundamentals of how their products work. Like if you want to be a founder, you should absolutely learn to code if you're going to do anything in the software space. And if you're not doing something in the software space, I guess I'd ask, why are you not doing something in the software space? It's absolutely the best space if you want to like, work at scale and actually, make a
I can't
difference.
imagine going to do a company at this point in my life where I'd have to like deal with supply chain. Not that like those companies shouldn't exist, but God, it sounds hard compared to
It should be done in
what
software, and it should be moved to software, frankly. And everybody is moving to software.
That's true. There are a lot of these problems getting automated. So one thing that's all this stuff that you just said about AI, the idea of jack of all trades workers, the idea of having kind of generalist knowledge across the board. An interesting question to me is like, what's the second order effect of that? And I want to get your take on this one that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is just because I've been noticing it at boot dev. So there's 10 of us on the team now. Yeah. There are projects that we would not have tackled because we didn't have the bandwidth to tackle them, and the like ROI on the project wouldn't have been there, right? Like it would have been too expensive to do the thing. To get just like very absolutist about it, let's just pretend we had a feature and we estimated that it would cost us, I don't know, $20,000 in resources to ship. And we stood to make $10,000 from it. Yeah. It's an easy no, right, for any business leader. But if all of a sudden it costs $1,000 to ship, that's just like a piece of work that it now makes sense to take on, even if you have to like hire someone to do it, that before you wouldn't have taken on. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. And I'm curious if you've noticed anything like this, just like work that didn't exist before because it was impractical that now exists and is making a job for someone.
Yeah. I mean, like localization is one of the things that we used to have a localization team, and they were all open source contributors from the community. Like we hire exclusively from the open source contributors. You'll never see like ex-Googler at freecodecamp generally. Although we have had staff that have gone on to work at Google and things like that. But generally what we do is we just look at open source contributors and say who's like who is doing this very prolifically, whom we could pay so they don't have to work a 40-hour job on the side and they can just do this full time, contribute to freecodecamp full time. That's how we bring people on. And so with regard to things that we wanted to do, we were spending a lot of resources on localization, and machine translation was getting a lot better. There had been lots of kind of like step changes in the quality of like Google Translate over the past 10 years, but LLMs really just like blew that open to where what we can do instead of having to translate things is we can just use machine translation, and then we just go through and we proofread the machine translations. We have a native speaker do that. And so that dramatically reduces the amount of work involved in localizing. So we were able to basically effectively like dissolve our localization team, repurpose all those people to work on different projects, mostly curriculum. Like virtually everything being done on freecodecamp right now is focused on like mobile app development, which is a big Flutter app, or curriculum development. And then like we do have like small crews that work on other things. Like I'm the only person involved in the podcast. I don't have anybody else helping me. Like I'm the only person involved in like the fundraising and the administration of the charity and like, doing that sort of stuff. And like, so we have lots of different product owners within the organization, and the nature of work can shift and change. But when you have something like an LLM, that instead of having to think of a whole lot of comprehension check questions for an exam, you can just feed in the content that the exam question should be based on. You can seed it with a whole bunch of questions that you've already written that have been carefully written by a human. We can say, hey, can you help me develop some more of these? And you cover this exam. And so you can include this in your mega prompt, essentially, in the context window. And then it'll go in and it'll come up with some questions. Then you can just kind of like much more quickly say, this question's like, let's come up with a different one. This one's kind of like irrelevant and things like that. So you can babysit the LLM, which is a lot faster and ultimately a lot cheaper in terms of developer hours than trying to come up with stuff from whole cloth. So it does reduce the cost. And we would, like, I've talked with like the people from the changelog. I've talked with a lot of senior devs, including like the founders of Stack Overflow. I got to interview both of them in their respective houses in New York and in California. And everybody says like LLMs are great. They're like a 20% improvement in productivity, which is huge. That is a huge improvement in productivity. And considering that we're still kind of pretty early in this, that can definitely expand. But what they really do is they decrease the cost. Like, I wouldn't trust LLMs to necessarily do novel stuff, but I would trust them to do stuff that is well understood and routine, which I can easily evaluate. And coming up with, multiple choice comprehension check questions for like articles and stuff like that, that is very much within the realm of what LLMs can do very well. And localization, same thing. So I look for those kinds of opportunities, and that's where we're applying them. I don't think like creating an AI agent and saying, hey, go create a Golang curriculum. I don't think it's going to end well.
Right.
Frankly.
It doesn't end well.
Yeah.
We've tested, not like full career, but like, hey, let's see if it can like generate a lesson. Lesson's not good.
Yeah.
And our goal has always to be to make like, there's a lot of coding resources out there. We want to like be really like not even top 10%, like top 1% in any, and LLMs just like are not even close to top 1%. Yeah, we do too.
Quality is like so much more important than quantity, and that is becoming more and more apparent every day as you Google search. And if you want quantity, you've got quantity in spades right now. I could just sit down and like have a very lengthy conversation with an LLM, and it'll all be novel and but like it's disposable. Right? Like at the end of the session, you close it and you never think about it twice, and you maybe just even skim the output from the LLM. You're just using it as rough ideation, essentially, and then you're going to go out.
You've probably never been tempted to share it, right? Like, oh, look at this great conversation I had with ChatGPT. I think I'll send it to my... I've never had that. At least, like, I think I'll just publish it. Like, someone will know. Cool. Well, so I have been very greedy with your time.
No, we've been going it's for totally chill.
The whole...
You asked very thoughtful questions.
Thank you. And thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, I just want to give you a chance to plug all the places. I mean, I know freecodecamp.org, obviously, but like anywhere else that you want listeners to
I just say check out the Free Code Camp podcast. It is me talking with smart people like Lane, and you can listen to the Lane episode. And I've just been gradually like ratcheting up the production quality and stuff like that. But one thing that is different about the Free Code Camp podcast is it is entirely unedited, like raw interviews. Like I consider interviewing a performance. If you watch Larry King live, those are not edited. They're literally live. And he sat there and he thought of questions and he did his research and he made a performance out of teasing insights out of people, just like you've done here, trying like keeping me talking and hopefully talking about things that are interesting to the people tuning in. But I do that every single week. On Friday, I drop a new episode, and I've got 160 episodes in the backlog. And I've talked with a lot of very smart people, including the Primogen on there. And I'm always looking to find up and coming devs, not just famous people. Like you're not going to see me like Lex Friedman interviewing like the prime minister of Israel and stuff. Like I'm never going to go there. That's not interested. I only want to talk to developers. So check out the Free Code Camp podcast. And if you have feedback on it, if you have people whom I should have on the show, anything, like I am never going to shoot the messenger. I very much value blunt feedback on my performance as a podcast host. And even if you have feedback on like my music, please get like, I noticed you're not using very much vibrato, like something like that. I'm like, sure, I would love to hear
it. Amazing. Thank you so much. Quincy Larson from Free Code Camp. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you later.
Cheers.